All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our final video lecture for Introduction to Literature. As promised, I thought we would end with a fun activity to replace. We were going to end the in-person class with the fun activity that you were going to present your final project. And I didn't think we could reasonably do that because, as I mentioned, I don't know if everybody has the same amount of access to various kinds of technology, so I didn't want to ask people to make videos. So again, writing assignment number 3, you will be posting publicly. Some people have already done it. Thank you for that. And I will be grading those. So do that on Canvas. Post your final writing assignment. And then that will be, once you're done with that, that will be it for the course. I will have all your grades tabulated in the Canvas gradebook, and that will be, you'll be finished with this class. And I hope you enjoyed it. But so I thought a good replacement activity, as I mentioned in the video last week, would be something that's pretty common in internet communications, which is a Q&A, a nice Q&A video where you could ask me any final questions that you still have about anything related to literature. And I asked you to post those in a discussion forum on Canvas, and most of you did. I got 22 questions, and I thought I will just put those into a slideshow and read them and answer them in a just kind of free form way. I didn't really prepare for this. I just pasted in the questions you asked into a slideshow. I read them closely enough just to I put some of them on similar topics together, so I wouldn't be going back and forth between topics. Some of the questions touch on similar issues or ask similar things in different ways. So I thought that that would consolidate things, but otherwise I didn't really prepare for this. I thought the best way to do it would just be to extemporize, to improvise, to just answer the questions as I go in kind of a casual way. So that's that. I'm gonna get into this. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for asking these questions. They were all over the map. And kind of amusingly, this is inevitable because there's 25 people, but it's interesting to see people asking about similar topics from obviously different points of view. So that was interesting, and I will try to answer in an honest and also diplomatic way to any of these questions. So without further ado, I'm just going to start. Oh, I did put as my intro slide, this was the first slide on my first lecture, so I thought it was a nice circling back to the beginning and the questions I asked in that first lecture. What is literature? Why does it matter? I think are questions that you've asked. Though some of you were bold enough, and I congratulate you, to ask not in so many words the question I was not myself brave enough to put on this slideshow, which was, does it matter? And I'm probably going to answer yes, but you don't have to agree. So we'll see. So let's get into it. Let's just see what we have. So we have learned about fiction, drama, and poetry in this class. I wonder if any other thing is considered as literature. If yes, then why did we only focus on these 3 elements in the class? Now, this is a kind of a complicated question, and some of you asked versions of it already. The answer is any other thing considered literature. The answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that departments of English and other departments that teach literary works in universities, and probably even in high schools at this point, so departments of English or other national languages like French or Japanese or whatever, or departments of comparative literature where they study literature in multiple languages, those departments have expanded to include visual media texts, whether that be film or comics and graphic novels. I myself, at my other job at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, regularly teach courses on graphic novels and on the history of comics. So I'm very much into that myself. So in that sense, yes. In that sense, the definition of literature has now encompassed film, graphic novels, television, forms of digital media, things like that as well. It's become pretty expansive. So that's the yes answer. The no answer is no, in the sense that literature does tend to mean art primarily conducted in words. So there's a literary theorist in the 20th century once used as a synonym for literature verbal art. And so in that more restricted sense, literature is fiction, poetry, and even drama here is a little bit complicated because drama is performed and is itself a visual media in certain ways. So there's a restricted definition of literature that it is a verbal art, and then there's an expansive definition that it encompasses any type of narrative or lyric or dramatic form, whether that be on film, whether that be on television, whether that be in a comic book. So that's the answer to that. Can anything else be considered literature? Yes, also no. If yes, and so I did give a yes answer, then why only these three elements in this class? I think that the answer to that is, well, one thing I'd ask you to keep in mind is if we had done the in-person version of the class for the whole semester, I was going to devote a whole class to film. We were going to watch one of the films of Hamlet and talk. I was going to introduce some specific film terms. We were going to talk about other ways that the play could be filmed. So I didn't intend to just restrict it. And I reproduced that as much as I could on that day. I asked you to watch some clips from Hamlet and talk about which ones you liked. So I did intend to do film in this class. But why the restriction to literature? Insofar as that's a personal question directed to me, I do think it's important, and I'm going to expand on this, I think, in answers to later questions. I do think it's important that I do think that there is, I'm trying to answer this in a way that is diplomatic. I think we don't want to lose the importance of language and what it can convey uniquely in a culture that's so visual. I think that a class like this can be a place to encounter ways of telling stories and talking about experiences that are done verbally and through language and don't rely on the visual, as so much of our culture does. It can be a place where we can hold on to that because I think it provides ways of thinking and ways of feeling that aren't available elsewhere in the culture. That doesn't mean I don't like or I disparage visual forms of narration. Like I said, I teach courses on comics and graphic novels. I particularly enjoy that medium of storytelling, but I do think it's nice to have that way of thinking and being still someplace in our culture, like in a class like this. Then the second question, I think these were two by the same person. How do I attract people to read literature? How do I approach students to make the lectures more interesting? And to make students more interested in literature? Well, I try to do what I did maybe to almost an excessive degree in some of those lectures on poetry that I did in the last few weeks, which was to emphasize that for all the complications involved in studying literature, all the technical terms and all the historical context, that, ultimately these works that are important to us because they're about life. They're about the things that we care most about in life. They're about how our societies are arranged. They're about how we deal with each other. They're about, I'm not trying to be cliched, but they're about the things that we all deal with: love and death and growing up and getting old and all of that. And so that's what I try to do. I try to say that, and it's not a question of under the complications, it's really about life. It's that it tells you something about life that you couldn't be told any other way through its complications. And I hope if I convey that, then I can convey a reason you should be interested in literature, because nowhere else can you find these topics discussed in this way. So I think that's how I would answer that question. You're probably the ones who can answer that question. Did I attract you to literature? Did I make you interested? I don't know. Maybe some of you I did, some of you I didn't. We'll see. So that's that. Next question. Right. So this is, we only focused on poetry, drama, and narrative. Why? I think I already answered that in the sense when I said that I think this course and some other courses in departments of English or literature are places that try to emphasize and try to try to teach the verbal art, the verbal side rather than the visual side of narrative. And whether or not you think that's good, I don't know. That's going to be up to you. I think it can be good. Like I said, I teach. I teach graphic novels. I teach pop culture. I wanted to do a unit on film in this course, but I also think it's important to hold on to complex uses of language and how they can convey human values and meaning and experience. Next question. Why do you think written literature has become such an influential force in our society? Stories and tales were obviously conveyed orally for a long time. So why did the practice of writing overturn that tradition? And the next question is related. Why do you think literature, in the sense of, I think, creative or imaginative writing, is different from other writing and gets more praise than other writing? And do I think it's overpraised? Let me answer those in reverse order. I think literature gets more praise than other writing just because people naturally, well, I don't know about naturally, maybe, I don't know. People, let's just say people tend to like things like stories more than they like things like, just very abstract arguments or just bare bones recitations of fact. So I think if literature, insofar as literature communicates stories, communicates narratives, communicates feelings, I think people tend to gravitate more toward that topic, that content, than they do to something like, say, philosophy or more scientific writing, because it's just more interesting to read writing that's about stories or emotions. I think I don't know, but that would be my answer there. Why is literature praised more than other kinds of writing? Why has literature... So this is an interesting question because it asks why literature is different not from contemporary visual communication, but why literature was different from what it replaced, which was oral communication. And there's been a lot of discussion of this. There's a classic book on this subject that it's actually not really about literature. It's just about language. It's called Orality and Literature by Walter Ong, O-N-G, if you want to pursue this. And he said that an oral culture and a written culture have two different worldviews. And when most of your culture is oral, it means that your culture is less invested in kind of stabilizing certain discourses, because the thing that writing makes possible is it makes possible something was said, but now it's written and now it's fixed. And it makes things like laws, like a formal system of laws possible that wouldn't have been necessarily possible in an oral culture. And Ong's position actually was to defend oral cultures a little bit, to say that written cultures have this, because everything is fixed, they become harder to change, harder to reform. There's a certain kind of totalitarian aspect to writing that sort of starts to control everything, and maybe oral cultures have a greater flexibility or a greater openness. But then he also says that there's advantages on the written side too. And the advantage primarily is that things can be preserved. And so I think that answers the question of why written literature is influential, because once you write something and it can be reproduced just as it was written, it can become more broadly disseminated throughout the society and is thus able to have a greater influence than an oral work, which is recited to the people in the room, but then the people in the room, it doesn't really go beyond them, or it goes beyond them in ways that are controlled by what they remember and not necessarily what it was. Some people say we're entering a phase that they call the Second Orality, which is that we now have a culture that's very oral, but it's very oral in ways that, like writing, are fixed formerly on film, on video, on digital media, just what I'm doing now. I'm speaking in an extemporaneous way as if I were talking to you in the room, but it's being recorded and you're going to listen to it. So many people think we're entering a new phase of society that has some features of the oral and some features of the written, a kind of recorded orality. So that was complicated, and I'm not an expert in this area. This is more like an anthropological question, but that's what I know about the subject, and that's what I'm able to tell you. Do I think the quality of literature has decreased in the modern era? Shakespeare, for example, is an icon for literature and has created many classics. However, I don't recognize any incredibly famous literature in recent years. This could be because they will become famous as years progress, but I was wondering if you think the overall quality of literature has decreased. No, I think I think we actually, I'm going to give this answer to a later question too. I think we did read some stuff in this course that is contemporary that's pretty famous and was both heavily taught in schools and also best-selling books. So the examples I would give would be, this is true of Toni Morrison, it's true of Jhumpa Lahiri, it's true of Amy Tan, and it's true of A.S. Byatt. Those are four writers we read in the fiction part of the course who are contemporary writers who have written best-selling novels or short story collections, and frequently taught, in schools, next to Shakespeare, just as we did. So I would say, in that sense, I don't think so. I think that there is still good literature, great literature being written that's popular, that is being taught to students. And so, yeah, I would say no. If I were going to give one maybe slight caveat to that, and it's related to what we were talking about earlier about the dominance of the visual in our culture, I don't think that, with the possible exception of Toni Morrison, I don't think that literature now is as verbally complex as it was in Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare was writing for a popular audience, and yet they were so attuned to the nuances of rhetoric and language that he could write so many double meanings into his work. And like I said, I think some writers do that. I think Morrison is probably the best example. You remember Recitative, how intricately complicated that work was. But I do think there's probably been maybe a decline in verbal complexity. Maybe that's made up for by the increase in visual complexity in film and comics and other media. But so in that sense, maybe a little bit. But no, in terms of overall quality of narrative, of characterization, of complexity of theme, I really don't think so. I think that I think we're all right, actually. So that's that. This question feels to me a little bit like the last question, asked from a different point of view. So I acknowledge that in this class we read a few works that were more modern, but why is it that most literature classes from high school to college focus on older works of literature? Are there less lessons to be learned from modern writers? Are there fewer writers writing in the modern day digitalized world? In my opinion, I think many college students would be able to connect better with some of the more modern pieces. So it's unfortunate that most introductory or general literature classes don't highlight modern writing enough. So I think that raises a lot of great points. I think I answered the parts in the middle. I don't think there are fewer writers writing, and I don't think there are fewer great writers writing than now. I do want to say, I there's no reason you should have noticed this, but one of the things I tried to do when I designed the syllabus was I tried to start with more modern and contemporary, so 20th century and after. I tried to start with that material. So we started, I think, with James Baldwin, and we were reading writers like Lahiri and Tan and Morrison with a few older works sprinkled in. And I started the drama section with the contemporary piece by Chiara Elleria Hudes. And so I tried deliberately to start with the more contemporary stuff to draw you in. And then we would go to the older stuff after spring break, so that it would be some of its alienating features, like the dense language of Shakespeare or the modern narrative construction of Sophocles, would maybe be easier for you to handle because you had gotten used to asking the questions of, what is the setting, what is the plot, what is the structure. So I agree with this. I think that students are more able to maybe immediately relate to more modern and contemporary stuff. And so I tried to acknowledge that by putting that material at the beginning and then ending with the older type material. I don't know if it worked. Maybe it didn't work. Maybe nothing would have worked because of the way our semester was disrupted. So that's my answer. As to why classes focus on older material, there's so much more of it, I guess, maybe is one answer. Also, some people, this has changed as I've gotten older. When I was younger, I did like more contemporary stuff too. now I actually prefer the older stuff just because it's like, well, I live in the contemporary world, so I don't need to read about it. But older literature is such an interesting, for me, you don't need to share this opinion, but for me, such an interesting window on the past. I wasn't there in the past, so what a great way to find out what it was like, what people thought and felt. But yeah, I agree that it can be better to start with the more contemporary stuff. And I tried, but I don't know, maybe not. I don't know. So moving on. How do you feel about modern TV shows and movies compared to more classic forms of entertainment like drama and fiction? Do you think they can be considered art like the literature we have studied? If so, could all TV shows be art or only some? Also, can all poems, plays, and fiction be considered art just by virtue of being a poem, play, fiction, or are there criteria on them as well? And on an unrelated note, what is your favorite Jane Austen novel and why? I'll get to that. How do I feel about more... Let me answer this question from the bottom up. So there's generally two ways of using terms like art and literature. There's a descriptive way, which and when I say something is art or literature, I just say it's something that belongs to that category of discourse in our society. So yeah, absolutely. Any poem, any TV show, any movie, any play, any novel, they're all art because they belong to that category that we've set aside in our society of if it's a type of writing or a type of storytelling or a type of narrative that is broadly speaking kind of fictional, or at least if it's non-fictional, it's arranged in some artistic way and we care about it on a level of craft and form and what it tells us through kind of indirect means. So in that sense, yes, anything, this is kind of stupid, but anything that's art is art. Then there's a way of using these terms that are more restrictive where you reserve them for only the good examples of the work. So only a good movie is art. A bad movie isn't art. Only a good novel is art, and a bad movie isn't art. I don't really like to use the term that way. I think if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. Just say it's good. Just say it's bad. We don't need to get into, well, this is literature and this is not. I don't really care for that. So I would say that I prefer to just use the descriptive term. Yes, any TV show, any movie, any novel, that's all art. And some of it's good and some of it isn't. How do I feel about modern TV shows and movies versus drama and fiction? I think that I think they can be equal in complexity and equal in power and in resonance and in interest. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily draw distinctions. I think, how can I say this? I think that some of the production processes on some more modern forms are there's so many people involved and there's so many financial considerations on TV shows and movies because there's such massive investments that I think that they are art forms that get more easily watered down and the vision of the creators gets more easily compromised because you have to please ultimately the people that are signing the checks. And so I think that maybe TV shows and movies have harder or higher barriers to doing serious work than, say, a novelist who maybe even if a novelist has commercial considerations in mind, it's still just that one person and maybe they're not compromising with 20 other people to please somebody writing the checks. So I think those monetary concerns impinge in ways. And I think that back in the old days when people were like TV and movies can't be art, that's a stodgy opinion and most people don't have that today. But I do think they had something like that in mind, and that is those financial considerations. And those financial considerations can be worth taking into account. But by the same token, there's nothing about telling a story through a filmed performance or through a visual narrative that would in any way make it less interesting than a verbal narrative. So that's how I would answer that. My favorite Jane Austen novel is Persuasion. I like it because it's her last novel or last completed novel, and it's got this very lyrical kind of autumnal sweetness to it. There are very experimental passages in it where she has, she's, well, I think I know who asked this, and I think you've probably read the book. So if you think of the passage where Captain Wentworth helps Anne get into the carriage, and she has this paragraph, almost a stream of consciousness narration about how that made her feel. It almost reads like a novel 100 years later. It almost reads like Virginia Woolf. So you can clearly see Austen experimenting with her technique. And it's, you see the tragedy of her early death, because who knows what she would have gone on to write. And it's also very funny when she's making fun of romantic poetry, and in the later parts of the book. And of course, the letter from Captain Wentworth that he sends Anne is so devastating. So yes, it's Persuasion. My favorite Jane Austen novel is Persuasion. All right. Next one. I have always found it interesting that the word literature is a generic term for written works, whether that be in novels, short stories, plays, or poetry. Yet in classes, we always read and engage with works that are considered to be great works of literature, like Shakespeare or Poe. Why is there never a unit on modern literature? I think I did kind of answer this, and I did try to do contemporary stuff too. I guess I think there's probably a bias, particularly probably still in high schools. It maybe exists less in college than in high schools, but I think there is a bias toward the older material, in the sense that I guess people think of it as part of like our historical heritage. I don't really think about it in those terms, but people do think of it as like some heritage that we're passing on, like a national or cultural heritage, and so that's why they focus on the older material. When I read the older material, I think of it as just as fresh and interesting as newer stuff, and so I don't think of it as some, relic from the museum to be handed on. So that might be my answer there. If I could pick one piece of contemporary literature to teach, what would it be? I won't name a work, but I'll name an author who I've already named, and who we read one piece by her in this course. That's Toni Morrison. I love to teach her work. Whether that be an early short novel like Sula, which I teach all the time, or sometimes some of her later, more complicated works like Beloved or Paradise. She's definitely my favorite contemporary author to teach, because she, you read Recitative, so you remember. She just has this way of writing about both the social issues that concern us most in contemporary society, but she does it in ways that make them so unfamiliar, because she has such a complicated and beautiful use of symbolism, and such a way with words. So you get kind of the best of all worlds with her. It's writing that's very relevant, but it's incredibly artistically profound, and normally students really resonate with her work. I noticed when we did Recitative in this class, you were a bit hesitant to engage with that story, and that's a very complicated work in a very short space. So I would recommend, if you want to read something by Toni Morrison, if you've never read one of her novels, I would start with Sula, her second novel. It's Sula, and that is that's not as, her early works weren't as formally complicated. And that is just an incredible story with told in an incredible style. So yeah, I like to teach Toni Morrison among contemporary writers most. And then I have two questions about Shakespeare and the question of his plagiarism. And I'm going to answer this by replacing the word there. So back when Shakespeare was writing in the early modern period, there was not a concept like we have it today of the author as owner of their works. So, for instance, Shakespeare wrote his plays for a company in which he owned shares, but he didn't own the plays. He wrote the plays, and they were the property, more or less, of the company. And so he didn't really consider himself the owner of his works. I don't think there were copyright laws in England at that time. I think there was just a sense that particularly drama was a collaborative, collective, communal art form. I would compare it to today. I don't actually know how screenwriting works to the same extent. I said I teach courses in comic books, so let me use that example. Like Marvel and DC Comics, these are big companies, and they will hire, a writer to write, Batman or whatever. And that writer, I think DC Comics or Marvel Comics, will own their Batman and Spider-Man story. They won't own it. They're doing it for the company. So Shakespeare, I don't think, had a sense of himself as the owner of his works. And I also don't think he had a sense of other authors as owners of their work. So yes, he did take his plots from other texts. In the case of Hamlet, he took his plot from a historical nonfiction chronicle called, I don't remember what it's called. The author was named Saxo Grammaticus, and it was a history of Denmark written by this historian, and Shakespeare borrowed the story of Hamlet from this work. But I don't think it was plagiarism even in our terms. I think the way to think about what Shakespeare was doing in contemporary terms is to think about a movie adapted from a book. He was writing plays based on nonfiction or fictional books, and he was adapting them for the stage in the same way that a modern screenwriter will take a novel or a work of popular history and adapt it for film. So that's the way to think about Shakespeare, I think, is not as a plagiarizer, because I don't think that term really applies to his historical circumstance. I think it's to think of him in terms of an adapter. And if there's does that lessen him as an author? Does that diminish him as an author? I don't think so, because everything that we praise Shakespeare for, he added to the works he was adapting. So I think the two things people praise Shakespeare for most are his incredibly inventive use of language and his incredibly rich development of character, his complexity of character. And both of those things he added to the works he adapted. So if you were to buy a Shakespeare play in an edition that printed the source he used, so for instance, the Signet Classics edition of Shakespeare always does this, and I have a ton of them here in my apartment. And if you were to read his sources, they're incredibly dry and boring. They're just painfully dry and boring. And why are they painfully dry and boring? Because they do not have his inventive use of language, his beautiful poetry, and they do not have his complexity of character development. So I think everything that makes Shakespeare Shakespeare, he brought to those sources. He didn't get from them. So I would answer no. It doesn't diminish him. Next question. You mentioned that you have read Hamlet many, many times, and I wanted to know, were you always able to get something new out of it every time you read it? There's a saying, I love this saying, I've never heard of it. There are 1,000 Hamlets in 1,000 people's eyes, and I want to know, has the image of Hamlet in your mind changed? Yeah, I do. I've read it. I tried to count. I think I've read it 9 or 10 times from high school to now, and I do get something different every time. What did I get out of it this time? Was the thing that really, I don't get something big out of it every time, because my mind sort of got made up around the third or fourth reading about what this play is all about. But the thing that I got out of it this time that I had never noticed before, and this will sound like a small issue, but it never really struck me what a complicated character Claudius is in his own right. Shakespeare just could have had a generic villain. He could have just been a bad guy. And he didn't give us just a bad guy. He gave us this person who's filled with guilt, who gets a soliloquy all to himself. That scene where he's trying to pray, it's actually quite poignant. He also seems, as far as I can tell, to truly love Gertrude. It seems like he was motivated in part by genuine love. He also seems to be a pretty good king. He settles the issue with Norway without going to war. So I think it's compelling, and I think it's a testament to what I was just saying about Shakespeare's power of characterization. I never really noticed that before, how much extra sort of care and attention he lavishes on this character that didn't need to be there. And I've noticed things like that before when reading Hamlet again, with Ophelia, for instance, how much is packed into her few scenes. So that's what I got this time. I was really impressed by the secondary characters, the sort of foil characters this time. We have another question about a specific text, which is, what are some of the reasons you find that make Antigone such a great piece? I found it difficult to read and not a great plot line, but because so many persons of literacy find it to be one of the greatest classics, I was wondering what you thought made it so good, and what were some of the experts' views on it as well. And that's a great question, and I do think it can be hard to read because, the ancient Greeks, the Athenians, who first, were writing and then watching these dramas, were experiencing them. First of all, I think I said this in my slideshow, these would have been substantially sung. It was more like an opera or like a musical than it was like a play. So we're reading it, number one, in translation from a very different language. It's a work from a very different culture, and we're missing that dimension of music. So there's a lot we're not getting when we just read it. And I agree, actually, that it can feel a bit flat. And when you read these things, I try to make an effort to kind of imagine what's the spectacles they would have been. So I agree, it can be tough. Why is Antigone so special? I think it's because of, if you'll recall on the slideshow, I had a little slide on the 19th century philosopher Hegel, Hegel. And he had a reading of Antigone that was very influential. And he said, what makes this play so great is that Antigone and Creon can't both be right, because somebody has to decide how to run that society. So one of them has to triumph, but they are each right on their own terms. It's kind of like what I was just saying about Claudius being an interesting villain. You can sort of think of maybe Sophocles as one of the first writers in the Western tradition to have the idea that the story is interesting insofar as it's not good versus evil, but it's two people, each holding views that we can find our way to sympathize with. And so there's poignance in each of their struggles and on both sides. Now you have to read into it a little bit because, Creon's not that sympathetic. However, Creon is kind of right when he says things like, well, there have to be laws and there can't be exceptions to the laws. And if I start making exceptions for my family, where does it end? So he gets some good lines in. And so I think that's the thing that makes Antigone interesting. The other thing that people love about Antigone historically is one of the chorus odes is about the wonders of humanity and how humanity conquers nature. And that's been popular over the years. People think that's very profound. Now, listen, if I was going to put together this, I taught Antigone because I thought we'd do an ancient Greek tragedy because they're very famous. And that was the one in the book. I would have picked Oedipus the King by Sophocles. That's much more dramatic, much more disturbing and violent, by the way, but much more dramatic. That's my preferred Greek tragedy to teach. So if you didn't like Antigone, I'd say don't give up. Read Oedipus the King if you can handle a violent drama of fate and incest. But that would have been my one to teach, and I have taught that in other classes. But Antigone, I think, is good because of the way the conflict is managed. Where do you think the line, if there is one, is drawn between analyzing a piece of literature and beginning to overanalyze the author's original intentions? I find that people sometimes break down every single word in a literary piece, which can often overcomplicate the work and its meaning. That's a great question. Do I think there can be an overinterpretation? Yeah, I think that every interpretation that's worthwhile will be justified by something that's in the text and will also be justified by, is this plausible in the author's context? So, for instance, you probably noticed when you're reading Hamlet, certain words didn't always mean the same thing. So words that we still use in Shakespeare's time might have meant something different or had a different connotation. So I think an overinterpretation is when you are bringing to the work ideas that can't possibly be found in the text, or that are not plausible for the context. Then I think you're over-interpreting. Now, I actually don't think breaking down every single word can be a problem. I think that can be interesting as long as it adheres to the sort of guardrails I just put up. Is this persuasive? Some readings are just too complicated or just not plausible for what the authors could possibly have had in mind given the context. That, I think, is over-interpretation. Here are some. I thought these three questions were sort of related, so I put them together. In your opinion, what is the grandest, most philosophical, most profound, most intellectual must-read novel/literature that you have ever read? What is a text that everyone on earth must read? So I actually think those are two very different questions. I think that one is a personal question and one is a more general question. So I don't know. Some of my favorite. I don't have one single favorite book. I read a lot of books. I've read a lot of books. I don't mean that in terms of bragging. I'm more like self-deprecating for just for mostly just caring about books. But yeah, I don't have one favorite. Some of my favorite novels are Ulysses by James Joyce, which I mentioned. We read his short story Araby. Ulysses is his grand experimental novel. That's really good. I really like Middlemarch by George Eliot, a 19th century English novel. George Eliot was, George was a pseudonym she went by. But she was one of the favorite authors, or the favorite author of A.S. Byatt, she wrote The Thing in the Forest. She reveres George Eliot for writing Middlemarch, and I agree with that. I love The Brothers Karamazov, a Russian novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So those are a couple of my favorites. Those are all from the last 200 years. Like I said, more contemporarily, I love Toni Morrison. More classically, I really do. I'm sorry to tell you, but I really do love Shakespeare and think he's great. So those would be, I've given you 5 there. Shakespeare, Toni Morrison, Middlemarch, Ulysses, Brothers Karamazov, others. What is a text that everyone on earth must read? So I actually thought really hard about that. What is a text that everyone on earth must read? And I came up with an answer that I think is not so much about literature and is more about being informed. And I hesitate to give you this because I think I haven't quite done this myself, though I've done a bit of it. I think that the texts everyone on earth must read are the texts that have been the most influential ones ever written. And if you think about that, what have been the most influential texts ever written in human history? I think probably the scriptures of the big world religions, the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, the Quran, the Hindu and Buddhist scriptures. I think those are the texts that probably everyone on earth should read because those are the texts that have had the most influence of everyone on earth. And then maybe when you get to the modern period, it shifts to political texts like the U.S. Constitution or the Communist Manifesto. So maybe those, you could throw those in. But yeah, I think the texts everyone on earth should read are the texts that everyone on earth has been most influenced by. But that's separate from literature. I don't know if I have a literary answer to that question. Though there's going to be a question later about are the religious scriptures literature. So we'll get there. What is one or more of the pieces of literature you first experienced that made you care so much about the subject? I think that if I had to give one answer, I would say that. So when I was a kid, I was a big comic book reader. And when I was about 12, I read the comic book, the graphic novel, Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. 12 might be a little young for this book. It's a bit, but my parents didn't have restrictions, or my father didn't. My mother did, but my father couldn't. She couldn't enforce it over my father's objections. So I read whatever I wanted. So I read Watchmen, which was a graphic novel imagining what superheroes would be like if they lived in the real world. And that's the basic concept. And you might have heard of it because there was a TV show and a movie and everything. And that was the first thing I ever remember reading where I thought, because I wanted to be a visual artist. I loved comic books and I used to draw a lot. and I thought I wanted to be a comic book artist when I grew up. I didn't know there was no money in it. There's no money in this either. There's no money in the arts. But Watchmen was the first thing I read when I was about 12 that really just stunned me with how well structured it was as a narrative and how profound the verbal level of it was. The narration and the dialogue and the speeches the characters made. And I think that was the thing I read where I really shifted my interest from visual art to literature. I was always going to go into the arts. I could never do anything scientific or anything with money or anything like that. I was always bound for the arts. I don't think, my mother might not have approved, but that was it. But that was where my interests really went to writing. I thought, what an incredibly written text this is, Watchmen. So that would be my answer. I don't know if I generally recommend that book to people. First of all, it's very violent, not appropriate for 12-year-olds. But second of all, if you're not already interested in superheroes as a genre, it might not mean anything to you. But though it's since become a classic, it's taught in college classes all the time, and I teach it all the time myself in other classes. So it's kind of attained that classic status, a contemporary classic. So Watchmen by Alan Moore, and he was the writer, and Dave Gibbons was the artist, would be my answer to that. And how has literature shaped or impacted your life personally? Also, what would you say the effects of literature are on people, and how does it impact them? And I feel like you'd be better off asking a normal person this question, because I just kind of live and breathe this stuff. It's something I consider more like my vocation than just like a hobby or something, and it's more even than my profession. It's mainly the thing I'm interested in, just as certain kinds of scientists just live and breathe that. Certain kinds of lawyers just do that all day and don't come home from work till midnight or whatever. It's the substance of my life. So that's how it's impacted my life personally. A cynical answer might be it prevented me from ever getting a more lucrative career, but I don't think I could have had a more lucrative career. This is just who I am. How does literature impact people who aren't like that? I think that if you're just a person who has other interests, but you also love literature on the side, and I know a lot of people like that too, in my personal life, my observation is that I think literature gives people a more nuanced understanding of society because it depicts it in such a complex way. And I think this will sound minor, but I think it's actually a cool thing to happen to you in life. I think it's a real vocabulary builder. I think it's a real way to expand your vocabulary. If you're reading works of literature, whether by a contemporary author who uses language very inventively, like Morrison, or older writers who are just using the language of their time, but it's different from our time. And if you're looking up the words and trying to sort of get with them, vibe with them, as the kids say today, on that level, I think it can really expand your sense of language. So that would be my answer there. Moving on, we had discussed at the very beginning of the course possible explanations for what attributes may constitute a text as a piece of literature. Do many people feel that religious texts such as the Bible or Torah are considered works of literature? In my opinion, I believe it would depend on each individual's interpretation of the text. I ask because certain sects of Christianity believe the literal written text, so to them it would be like a historical text. Right, so this is kind of a dicey subject a little bit, because so for people who I'm just going to stick to Christianity because it's what I know best. I have definitely learned about other religions, such as Judaism and Buddhism and Islam. But I'm going to stick to Christianity because that's the one I understand best, and I myself was raised as a Christian. So let's take the Christian Bible as our example. For people who are very devout believers, the Christian Bible is the inspired word of God. And so for them, it would be a blasphemous thing to just equate that with a merely human created work of literature, like a novel. So for them, they would not consider it, I don't think, a work of literature in the same sense, because it is the inspired work of God. And I think I think the Quran has the same status in Islam, as I understand it, as well. So for that, for devout believers, they would probably answer this question no. Now, for people who are not devout believers or who take a secular perspective, yeah, there's a class the University of Minnesota English department offers called the Bible as Literature. And I think most English departments of most colleges and universities offer a class called the Bible as Literature. Why? Well, because if you read the Bible, you're going to find narratives or, lyric poems so you're going to find the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. What do they do but tell a story with incredibly interesting characters, and it's this fascinating plot. And what do you find in, say, the Song of Solomon, but beautiful lyric poetry, or the Book of Ecclesiastes, or the Psalms, nothing but a compendium of lyric poetry. So absolutely, the Bible has all the elements and attributes that we would consider, literary, and so it can absolutely be read on that level. Also, another thing to bear in mind is some works that we read as literature, and we don't read them any other way, had profound religious significance to their audience. And there's no better example of that than Antigone. But that faith is one that's not really shared, by most people. So we read it as a secular work of literature, but it would have had religious significance to the audience. So it's a really complicated question, and it's a question where, there's a potential to give offense. I don't mean to offend anyone, by all means, if you consider it not literature because it's a sacred work, I absolutely understand that. So that's some of the ways I would answer that question. What do you think makes literature great or timeless, especially in the case of an author such as Edgar Allan Poe, whose writings weren't regarded as great till after his death? What changed and made his works classic as they are considered today? And then, related question, what sets apart literature that is typically considered good by critics from literature that is not? So, what makes a work timeless or classic? It's pretty hard to answer that, I think. Well, there's a pragmatic answer to this, which is it's not going to satisfy you. But the works that are considered classic are the works that people have passed on for whatever reason. So it's not just that somebody thought of it that way. It's that somebody thought about it that way enough to keep printing the texts, to keep making new editions, to keep teaching it in schools, and then creative writers to be influenced enough by it so that you would have to say these writers were influential. And I think that's something I haven't mentioned yet. One of the things that makes a work classic is that it's had an enormous influence on the works that came later. Edgar Allan Poe is a good example because Edgar Allan Poe was incredibly instrumental in inventing several of the most prominent popular genres of literature that we just take for granted today, such as horror fiction, detective fiction, and science fiction. And so if you care about those genres, you have to go back and read him because he was foundational to setting up those genres. So often, if an author is influential, then that makes them kind of unavoidable classics. Sophocles is another good example because so much of our ideas of what makes a tragedy come from Sophocles. So influence is one. I do think there has to be an element of it's a work's being about something in human life that isn't likely to change much over the course of time. So again, the fundamental conflict in Antigone is, should you primarily be loyal on the one hand to your family and your faith, or on the other hand to the government, if those come into conflict? And that's something that we see that is just something that hasn't changed all that much as a basic conflict in human life. There were people last week, they were protesting, some of the measures taken by the states to quarantine people due to the pandemic, and they were quarantining religious services. And some people were saying, well, the state doesn't have the right to say that people can't gather for religious services. So we read a 2,500-year-old work about the conflict between faith and government, and this conflict between faith and government is playing out in the news right now. So I think so that's number two. So number one, there has to be a quality of being influential. Number two, there has to be a quality of a human problem that's not going to go away anytime soon that the work is about. And number three, because so much of what makes a work classic depends on if it finds its way into being a work that interests educators and is taught in school, I think there has to be a level of formal complexity, of artistic complexity in the way it's put together, whether that be the structure or the language. So I would say that those are the three elements. Is it influential on the works that came after? Does it deal with a perennial human topic? And is it artistically, formally arranged in an interesting way that merits and rewards study? And I think that those are also, that answers the second question on this slide. Those are the things that set apart literature typically considered good from literature that is not. All right, moving on. If the definition of literature is limited to human writing behavior, which of those writings belong to literature and which do not belong to literature? Where is the boundary between literature and non-literature? Should a good literary work improve the reader's spiritual level or enrich the reader's cognition of society? I think I sort of answered the first part already when I talked about, literature is a category set apart largely because it's where it's often considered either a fictional work or a non-fictional work where the primary interest is in how well it's written and how well it conveys certain ideas, feelings, or emotions or attitudes. So the works that don't belong to literature are works that are not primarily interesting on that level. There is not a hard and fixed boundary there. So there might be a hard and fixed boundary. Let's say you have a novel and you have a instruction manual for how to use your new phone. It's clear that the instruction manual is probably not literature, but the novel is literature. Where this becomes complicated is certain works were written to just have pragmatic and practical effects in the world, but they're primarily remembered for being well written and interesting. So an example I might give would be the earliest written works of history in the Greek tradition by Herodotus or Thucydides, who were contemporaries of Sophocles. Contemporary historians no longer think those works are reliable as history, but they're still in print because they're written very well. A more contemporary example would be the works of Sigmund Freud from the early 20th century. He was one of the founders of psychoanalysis, which I don't think modern psychologists and psychiatrists consider to be, I don't think they consider him to be a reliable guide to psychological science today, but he had so many interesting, almost poetic insights into human nature that his works are still in print today, and I think read more as beautiful sort of essays, even though he wouldn't have wanted to be remembered that way. He thought he was a scientist, and I don't think scientists, respect him very much today. It's we people in the English department who still read Freud. So it's a porous boundary. But I think the boundary is between what is primarily interesting for how it is written and how it conveys something and what isn't. Should a good literary work improve the reader's spiritual level? And I'm not entirely sure what's meant by that, like emotions or, like uplift the soul, I don't know, or enrich the reader's cognition of society. So maybe the way to think about that is, should it primarily help you think about externals, the way your society is, or should it be kind of a psychological uplift? Ideally it would do both. I think a good literary work should do both. Some are maybe more on one side than the other, but I think the best works will be both socially relevant and kind of emotionally profound. Let's see. Do you agree with the notion of banned or censored books? I have never understood why places like schools and libraries have banned books for different reasons like racism and violence. In my opinion, we don't need to stop learning and teaching books that include harsh topics, especially books that are heavily praised in literature. It allows for an understanding to the racist system that has been uplifted for a long time. We should probably examine why these books are the way they are, not ban them. I think I pretty much agree with this as written. I do think I would add to this, there's two separate questions. Should a work be taught, and how and to whom, and should it be in a library? So I think let's take the classic example here is Huckleberry Finn. So the reason I think people started saying, well, Huckleberry Finn shouldn't be taught in schools is because it was, I think, years ago. This was way before I was in school. This would have been like, let's say, the 50s or 60s. What would have happened was Huckleberry Finn would have been taught in, say, middle school. And the whole issue of racism probably wouldn't have even been raised in the class discussion. And so it would have just been treated as this like interesting, innocent, wholesome, adventure novel. And so people started saying, well, it's not that. And if you don't address the themes of it, then you're just perpetuating some of the racist attitudes that it might convey. And so I think the solution to that is you have to teach a work like that by addressing, just as the person asking the question here says, by addressing the fact that the book is about racism, is in some ways challenging the racism of its time, is in other ways complicit in the racism of its time, and you have to address it with that level of nuance. So I think, I do think that you can say, I think it's okay if teachers say, number one, maybe we were teaching this book for too young an age level to grasp the work on that level. So maybe let's get that out of middle school and put it into high school. I also think it's okay for people to say, maybe there's better works that can address the subject. However, I totally agree in general that we can't just throw out the works of the past for ideological reasons entirely. We need to examine them on that level. Like I tried to do that in this class. I tried to say, I tried to address the ways in which Hamlet was about gender. And that's probably not something that would have been addressed 50 years ago when that was taught in schools. So I think we have to do that. So I think there's room to have a discussion about what books should be taught and how they should be taught. Now, about removing books from libraries, no. I'm sorry, this is my personal opinion, but that's just censorship, taking a book out of a library. Especially, librarians, like teachers, have to decide what books should be in the library and what not. So obviously they're going to make decisions. But a work that's been so broadly influential, because that's what's happening in some of these school controversies where they're literally taking books like... there was just an example last week. What was the book? Or there were a bunch of different books that a school board in Alaska banned, and they wanted them taken out of the library. And it was like The Great Gatsby and To Kill a Mockingbird. Like, no, you can't take books out of the library. We could have a discussion about what books are best to teach and for what reason and to what grade level and how they should be approached, but not removal from the library. So that's my answer to that question. That's it. So that is the end of our Q&A. I thank you for asking these questions. You've been a great class, by the way. I don't just say this. Both when we had the in-person class, I was impressed by your participation, your interest. I thought we had great discussions. And when we transitioned to the online learning, the level of participation is higher than in any of my other classes, just in terms of the number of people doing it and the effort you're making. And so I really appreciate that. I hope that you enjoyed this class despite the way it was disrupted. I hope you got something out of it. I hope that you found something you enjoyed. I know that not everybody could like everything we read. I don't actually like everything we read, but I hope you found something that you liked. I hope you plan to go on reading literature if you want. If not, congratulations for getting through this course credit. And I hope you have a great week. I hope you have a great rest of your semester. I hope you have a great summer. I wish you luck with the rest of your school career and with the rest of your lives. So I'm going to sign off. I don't know, what should my sign off be? Remember when at the beginning of the semester, when we were in person, we discussed whether or not works of literature ultimately boil down to the famous message, live, laugh, love? Maybe that will be what I send you away with. Live, laugh, love. And thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. That'll be it for the class. Thank you and goodbye.